It's October, it's Halloween, and there's no better way to celebrate but tell you my top 10 scariest horror movies of all time.
Everybody's a suspect!
Coming to get you, Bobber.
Wolfman's got Nards!
Now obviously this list is very subjective. Everyone has their own fears, everyone has their own preferences. Just like me, I know that my number one spot is very selective for what I fear the most. Personally, I won't get into that yet because that would spoil it. So everyone's opinions are different. Now, some of the movies on this list are not great movies. This isn't the 10 best movies. This isn't the 10 best horror movies that I've seen in my life. Some of them are movies that I don't actually love, but they're okay. But they're movies that scared me. Whether they scared me as an adult or a child makes no difference, because there are movies on this list that did scare me as a child, and although they don't scare me today, they still have an effect on me that movies today don't have. So you'll probably find that most of the movies on this list are older. Some of them are quite new as well. There's a lot of movies out there that did scare me as a kid. A lot of movies that are out there that are quite scary. So it was hard to bring it down to a top 10. There might be movies that I've forgotten all about, that I forgot to add to the list. Or there might be movies on it that I just didn't add because they didn't have that scare factor for me like they might have for you. So I've got a few honourable mentions there as well. And I'll go through them quickly because they are worth mentioning, but they just didn't make the top 10. Some of them, in no particular order whatsoever, are movies like Dead End from 2003. Not a particularly great movie, but it had an effect on me. Even though I was like 19 years old at the time when I watched it, but it had an effect on me, that isolation. That was a very scary movie with some really freaky moments. Another movie that's worth mentioning is John Carpenter's The Thing. Not a particularly scary movie, it's more of a sci-fi horror than a pure horror movie, but I think what scared me with that movie was the practical effects, because to this day it still has some of the best practical effects of all time.
Clear!
Another movie, and I didn't really like this movie, was Candyman from 1992. What scared me about Candyman was Candyman's voice, as well as the score that they used for the film. It Follows was another one that wasn't particularly scary, some really freaky moments, but it was helped mostly by the score by Disaster Piece. And lastly, Eden Lake. Not particularly a horror movie, but it has horror elements to it, and I think what scared me the most about Eden Lake was it was a very realistic movie. I'm from the UK, and I think that what we saw in the movie is things that we generally see in and around the UK. Maybe not to the extent that we saw in the movie, but the movie was just so gritty and realistic and very scary for that reason. But there are lots more horror movies that did scare me that just didn't make it into the top 10, but those were just some honourable mentions. And at number 10 is Paranormal Activity. Now I'll probably say this a couple of times during this, Paranormal Activity is not an amazing movie, and in fact I prefer the Blair Witch Project to Paranormal Activity. However, the Blair Witch Project's not on this list at all because it didn't scare me whatsoever, but it was more effective for me. I just think that Paranormal Activity played with my emotions more than the Blair Witch Project did, and the reason for that is because who hasn't lain in their bed and thought they've heard something? Who hasn't lain in bed thinking about things like ghosts and stuff? You hear noises downstairs, you want to play with a Ouija board. Those types of things are things that happen in the real world. Maybe nothing happens, but those are feelings that you have in the real world, and then when you see it in a movie like the Blair Witch Project, it adds realism to it, because what you're seeing is stuff that you would see generally on a video camera without obviously the effects that they put into the movie. So I think it was a very realistic movie, and yes, it's a jump scare movie at the end of the day, but the jump scares were very effective and properly used. And at number 9 is Rec, or Record. This is the Spanish version of Quarantine. Obviously Quarantine was a remake of Record, and I remember going to the cinema to see Quarantine over 10 years ago, 12 years ago or so, and I thought that was a really good movie, very effective, and I was intrigued in seeing the original. And that's why I do like remakes, because sometimes a remake makes you want to watch an original. I'd never seen Wreck before, so straight after the cinema I came home and watched Wreck, and it was about midnight I started watching it, and I think that was an amazing movie, worthy of being in a top 10 horror movies of all time, never mind a scary movie. But I think that Quarantine done a really good job for an American version. I think that Record was more brutal and a lot more scary. I think the scary part about it was that it was in Spanish. So when I seen people freaking out or calling for help in another language, it's almost had that barrier where I thought, I'm not understanding them and I feel really scared for them. And I think the camera movement, the zombies in it or whatever they were called, were just really scary. And the thing up in the basement as well, absolutely frightening. And at number 8 is The Conjuring. Now this might be cliche for a lot of you guys because there's a lot of movies like The Conjuring out there like Sinister, Insidious, all those types of movies. And those movies aren't my cup of tea. I'm not a massive fan of those types of movies. But when James Wan directed The Conjuring, there's not a lot I want to tell you about this at the moment because there's another movie after this, not straight after it, but another movie in my top 10 that I want to talk about that's similar to The Conjuring. And I think The Conjuring was the first movie in a long time, if not the first movie since the movie I'm going to say later on, that genuinely scared me in terms of being a haunted house movie, because there's a lot of haunted house movies out there, like the Amityville Horror remake for example, that they gave you a lot of jump scares without building up that tension. I think what James Wan done perfectly in this movie was built that tension throughout the entire movie, and that was incredible the way he done that. I was genuinely scared when I watched this movie in the cinema. I was 29 years old when I saw this film. I didn't think I could be scared anymore from movies, and The Conjuring was one of the ones that proved that you could still be scared depending on how they make a movie, and James Wan made this perfectly. And at number 7 is Just Before Dawn. Now this is a really old movie, and one of the movies that I watched when I was a kid. I forgot the name of it when I was a kid as well, and I just remembered about 15 years ago or so. But watching this movie today, it still has the effect, and I think it's really down to Brad Feidel's score, which was incredible and very eerie, and also the isolation of this film because they did film it on location, which helped. The acting wasn't great. It was, some people would consider it a poorly made movie, but I think it's one of the superior movies, one of the best backwoods slasher movies of all time, and it is still one of those to this day. It scared me because of how I saw the movie as a kid. I'm not as scared of it anymore, but it still had the effect on me, just like some of the movies on this list. And Just Before Dawn, if you haven't seen this movie, I recommend that you see this as soon as you can. Hi. And at number 6 is The Exorcist. Now a lot of you will have The Exorcist on your list because it is a genuinely scary movie, but I had the opposite effect to The Exorcist as I did a lot of movies on my list. And what I mean by that is I wasn't scared of The Exorcist when I was younger. I laughed when I watched this, and I think it was a nervous laugh when I was a kid because I wasn't understanding what I was watching. All I saw was a movie that was supposed to be banned in my country, so everybody wanted to see this film, and I watched and I thought, why was that banned? It was funny, although it wasn't funny. I just pretended it was funny when I was a kid. I just didn't understand it. But then watching as a teenager, watching it as an adult, watching what this girl goes through in the movie, obviously, Reagan, it was genuinely terrifying. And hearing the noises, the things that happen before she becomes possessed, was probably the scariest parts for me because I knew what was going to happen. Again, when you watch this film over 40 years later, it's a genuinely terrifying movie, not just because of what you see on screen, but what happens. And it was based on a true story. Obviously, some of it will be fake, and it would be dramatised as well, but things that somebody could go through in that situation is genuinely frightening, and for that, this is still one of the scariest movies of all time.
Damien!
Amen.
And at number 5 is A Nightmare on Elm Street. I'm sure there's a Nightmare on Elm Street movie in all of your top 10 or top 20 horror movie lists, and this wasn't an amazing movie. I really liked A Nightmare on Elm Street and I love the franchise overall, but there's something about the first movie that genuinely frightened me. I don't know if it was down to the front cover when I went to see it in the video store, or watching it as a 5-year-old kid. That scarred me for life. But knowing that there's this character that comes to you in your dreams, that's what brings it up a notch, because you can go to bed and go to sleep and forget about everything. But when you dream about Freddy Krueger, that's when he's a threat to you. So when you're watching this movie as a kid, I blame my parents, but I love my parents for it as well. But when you watch this movie as a young kid and then go to bed, you think you're surrounded by your family, which is great. But when you go to sleep, that's when the nightmares start to happen. So I think that adding a Nightmare on Elm Street as one of the scariest movies of all time was an easy thing for me to do. There are some other movies in the franchise that were still really quite scary, like Part 2 was quite scary, but I just think the original had a lasting effect on me, mainly because I watched it very, very young. And at number 4 is Pet Sematary, the original Pet Sematary. Now, the story itself wasn't scary, and I think sometimes the movie felt a little bit fluffy at times, but I think what makes this one of the scariest horror movies of all time is because some of the scenes that are in this movie. I mean, this movie has one of the scariest characters of all time, Zelda. Even though it was a girl who was disabled, watching this movie as a kid, that scarred me for a long, long time. And even when you watch it today as an adult, this is one of the movies that I probably won't show to my son for a very long time because of Zelda. If he wants to see it, then that's up to him. But watching Zelda, even today, is very scary. I think she reminds me of a movie called Mask. I think it's from 1985, starring Eric Stoltz and Cher. Now, that movie's not on this list because it's not a horror movie, but that movie scared me. And it's a shame because obviously it's a disabled boy called Rocky Dennis who had a disfigurement, and it's not something to laugh about or something we should be scared of. But as a kid, you're scared of disfigurement. And I think Pet Sematary, being a horror movie that it is, and amping up the disfigurement of Zelda, that was absolutely frightening. And obviously you've got Gage, who was killed at the side of the road by a big truck, and that made me scared of motorways as well, or even highways or expressways or whatever. There's a lot of scenes in this film that just completely scared me. And at number 3 is The Haunted. Now, some of you have probably not even heard of this movie. It's a TV movie from 1991, and this is probably the original Conjuring universe movie because it does feature Ed and Lorraine Warren. They took part in this Smurl haunting. So the Smurl family, just like the Perrin family from the Conjuring, this is the movie that I wanted to talk about when I was talking about The Conjuring. This movie frightened the life out of me when I was a kid. When you watch it today, and if you're watching it for the first time, you probably think, wow, that's terrible. And it probably is a bad movie now, but I spoke about this movie almost every day as a kid. I was fascinated with this movie. I was fascinated with the story, and I think because of The Haunted, I was fascinated with other movies like The Conjuring when that came out, because when The Conjuring came out, before it came out, I knew it was Ed and Lorraine Warren who was also characters in The Haunted, and I thought, wow, this sounds like a remake of The Haunted, so that intrigued me. Obviously I found out it wasn't a remake, it was just another case that the Warrens took over. So going back to The Haunted, there's scenes in that will haunt me forever. And I think those of you who have seen The Haunted will know what scene I'm talking about, or what scenes I'm talking about. But one of the scenes in particular was at the end of the movie when you just hear this.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Janet? I'm in here, Mom!
Oh. And at number 2 is The Exorcism of Emily Rose. Now, this movie, it's a horror movie, of course, but it's also a courtroom drama. And you're probably thinking, a courtroom drama being one of the scariest horror movies of all time? Absolutely. I think when it goes back and forward, it gives the viewer, me personally, a break from being so scared. Because anytime we go from the courtroom to what happened leading up to the courtroom case, it's haunting. It's so scary. Jennifer Carpenter, I believe it is, that plays Emily Rose. She's in Dexter. Now, I read about this case before I saw the movie, and I saw pictures when I believed in ghosts and stuff like that, and when I saw pictures of Emily Rose, not known as Emily Rose in real life, they changed the name for the movie, I thought, look what that poor girl's been through. It's absolutely horrifying. And then when you see the movie, the scenes where she's not possessed yet, but she's becoming possessed, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. It's absolutely scary. And when she gets possessed and becomes this whole demon thing, you know, although I know it's not real what I'm looking at, it's still frightening. And that's one of the movies that when you're finished watching it in the cinema and you come home, the experience comes home with you. And then when you go to bed, the experience comes to bed with you as well. I won't give anything away because this is one of the movies that is quite popular, but some people haven't saw it, so I won't give anything away. But I urge you guys, if you're into scary movies and you've not seen The Exorcism of Emily Rose, I highly recommend it. It will scare you.
Emily?
In at number 1 is An American Werewolf in London. Now, I didn't want to tell you at the beginning, guys, but my biggest fear is werewolves. Yes, this is the only werewolf movie on the list, but that's because other movies below are really scary. There are some scary werewolf movies that I've saw before, but this is the ultimate werewolf movie, and for so many different reasons. Now, when I watched it as a kid, again, I watched it as a kid, and that's when it scared me the most. I didn't see all the comedy elements to that movie when I was a kid. All I was watching was scary scenes and werewolves, and that was it, and that frightened the life out of me for years. And watching it today, all those same scenes that scared me are still very scary, but I see the lighter side to it as well, even though it is still scary. It's still a scary movie. It's not the greatest horror movie of all time. It's not the darkest horror movie of all time, but when they bring on the scares, my god, they are very scary. One of the scenes that scared me in particular is when you don't see a lot, and that's in the moors at the beginning when the werewolf was circling them. That's scary. Not seeing what's circling them is scary enough. And then you get the transformation scene, which is absolutely terrifying, and again, all down to the practical effects and the music at the time. There's a scene in the underground where the man's getting chased by the werewolf. There's a lot of memorable scenes in this movie that haunted me for years, and some movies on the list have 1 or 2 scenes, but this movie's got maybe 4 or 5 scenes that scared the life out of me, and watching it today is just as effective. So there we have it, guys, 10 of the scariest horror movies of all time, in my opinion. Some of you might have not heard of some of these movies. The ones that you haven't heard of, I highly recommend them. It doesn't mean you're going to be scared of them, not at all. These are the type of things that scare me. Werewolves, possession movies scare me a lot as well, even though I don't believe in all of that. They still scare me because of the fact that they could be true, because obviously it's not scientifically proven. But yes, so that's my personal top 10 scariest horror movies of all time, guys. Obviously, I really want to know what you think of that 10. If you've seen any of them, leave your comments down below. Let me know what you think of them. Let me know if you liked them, but also let me know if they scared you in the same way they scared me. But I also want to know your recommendations. What are some of the scariest horror movies you've ever seen? They don't have to be great. They don't have to be masterpieces. All I want to know is, did they scare you? Because they could scare me too.
Sometimes that is better.
As always, guys, thanks a lot for watching. Thanks for subscribing. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.